Today we're going to be talking about a new process called BATIK, and it has some pretty neat history. BATIK is done all throughout the world, but has its origins disputably in Indonesia, very possibly in Africa or Asia. But we'll take a look at the little different styles of BATIK. BATIK is basically dyeing, a process of dyeing cloth by using wax, a wax resist, dunking the cloth into dye and then removing that wax. And it's a pretty fun process. It's a process that we actually teach at Minnesota State University in a class, the crafts class, and Art 140. And so some of our students make BATIK. It's a pretty cool thing. So let's take a minute and talk about BATIK. What is it? Well, let's talk about the process a little bit. In a BATIK, most often there's oftentimes a cotton fabric that is used. And traditionally it has to be either like a real light beige or tan color or white. And a design is often either drawn out on that or is in the mind of the artist. And once that is kind of drawn out or planned out on the fabric, a melted wax is used to brush on you can do anything. You could splatter, pour, but maybe traditionally, like I spoke about in Indonesia, there's something called a chanting tool, and it has a little reservoir where melted wax is placed, and then that flows out through a small little kind of pipe, and can do nice detailed kind of drawing with melted wax. And that wax goes into the fabric, soaks in, and then it becomes hardens as it cools. And now you have this, let's say, a white cotton sheet with all this little bits, designs, and things with wax. The next step would be taking this sheet and then putting it into a vat of dye. So you can put it into a dye. Indigo is it's an organic dye that is a popular one that's been used historically. Of course, today there's so many other synthetic dyes that can be used, but an organic dye. So you dunk this whole sheet with the wax on it in this vat. You take that out, and that dye has worked its way into the cotton fibers. It's secured there, and when that dries, then you would take this fabric, and most often, you have to get the wax out. So how do you do that? Today we can do several methods. Sometimes people use an iron with different pieces of newsprint and kind of lift the wax out. But probably most popular traditionally would be to boil it, because once again that wax is going to melt in a boiling cauldron and then float up to the surface, and then you can take this cloth out, hang it up again to dry, lay it out, and you can do another stage with your wax. So you can continue to either protect certain areas that you've already dyed, or go into new white areas, creating new designs. And then once again, you can take that, bring it to a different colored dye, dunk it, get that dye in it, take it out, boil it out, and so on and so forth, as many times really as you'd like. So there are some very simple batiks that maybe are just one or two colors. And then we also see some examples of very complex batik where there are many colors in the palette and very fine detail. So much of the work can be done by hand. There's also a stamp that we can use to dunk into hot wax and just kind of stamp it along the fabric to create a repeating pattern on for example, a blanket or a cloth that could be used for clothing. So, of course, the sari that's often worn, for example, in India, can be done in batik and then be cut up and sewn up into a garment, or of course used as curtains or anything else in the home. And this process dates way back. Some as really, I think I saw as maybe 700 AD or something, maybe even beyond that. So it's a really kind of fun, unique process, and because we don't work with hot wax really with kids, Though I have worked with this with a special artist in residence and done hot wax with kids batik. We're going to use this a little bit friendlier version of using acrylic paint and the glue, like I mentioned. So it'll be kind of fun. We're attaching ourselves with this historical way of doing working with cloth, and I think you'll enjoy it. We can see here a batik that's just a basic kind of wax that goes over, probably pretty solid. The fabric is covered with wax, and then the artist just kind of crinkles up and breaks the wax once it's hardened. And this creates little cracks that when it's dunked into the vat of dye, the little cracks can get some dye seeping in and make these very interesting patterns. We see that in several of these African ones that we're looking at right now. You can see the by hand nature. You can see the heavy, kind of more geometric patterns. That will be some stamping is used to repeat the same shapes again and again. And we can see here the concentric kind of rings of these kind of fabrics. We also see, for example, here a Chinese work, and Chinese also, of course, are doing batik for centuries. And here we see a traditional kind of Indonesian one, very elaborate, lots of colors, very intricate designs. Again, using those chanting tools. Here's a pillow, and this is kind of cool because it has that almost indigo type blue color. But what's kind of fun is that you may use your piece to cover over a pillow. That might be a final end for your piece that you're working with. So that's a little bit look at some batik. We'll be working today also thinking about using a grid to do our design. And so we're thinking about pattern, and we'll be using, instead of dyes, we're going to be using acrylic paints, and instead of wax, we're going to be using some glue, just like school glue. As we think about these batiks we're going to make, we're going to look at some patterns by another artist. This particular artist is not a batik artist, but rather does more painting and drawing, does some enamel artist, but his name is James Sienna, and he does some really interesting pattern work where he kind of uses a grid, but he starts to flex and push and pull in the grid and move it around in interesting ways. And this is called an iterative grid, and kind of tricky to say, iterative. And it's the iterations. You've probably heard this in mathematical kind of terms, but it's basically just the grid again and again, just with things slightly adjusted. So this is a fun thing you can do with elementary age kids, and I think you're going to really like it. Though working with batik, you have to remember, you can't critique a batik. So here we go, let's get into it. You can't assess a painting. Is it better glossy or matte? You can't evaluate a sculpture. Tell me, is it better bumpy, flat? But there's just one thing you cannot do, and it's sitting right in front of you. You can't critique a batik. There's just no way. You can't critique a batik. There's really nothing to say. You can judge a mosaic. It's not the best color for the grout. You can size up a clay teapot. Is that an appropriate spout? But there's just one thing you cannot do, and it's sitting right in front of you. You can't critique a batik. It's a magical thing. You can't critique a batik. Just makes you want to sing. You can estimate art value, maybe 3,000, no 4. You can measure your textiles, give the hem a little bit more. But there's just one thing you cannot do, and it's sitting right in front of you. You can't critique a batik. Nobody can. You can't critique a batik. Not even Oprah or Roseanne. You can't critique a batik. Really nowhere you can. You can't critique a batik. Not in China or Japan. Not in Nepal or Bhutan. Not on TikTok or Instagram. Not on Fox or C-SPAN. Not in Turkmenistan. Not in North Korea or Iran. Not in your Dodge Caravan. Not even Cozumel or Yucatan. Not even in old Afghanistan. Not in Kazakhstan or anywhere in land.